Gary, good afternoon. How are you?
Good, thanks, Leo. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Gary. Very well. Wonderful weather continues, as does market volatility. Now, you've kindly written an article for us. Since then, I know the last couple of days the markets have been up and down. We'll probably come back to that a little bit. But I wondered if you could take us through the contents of your article, specifically the charts, why you've put them together, what do they all mean?
Oh, sure. Before I get onto the charts, let me just make one prediction I'll be right on. Market volatility will continue long after this sun ends, Leo. It will continue long after this sun ends.
Sure.
Um, so, the Office of Budget Responsibility, the OBR, published its forecast for the economy last week, and it said that it predicts that Q2 2020 will see a drop in GDP of minus 35%. Now that's colossal. That is colossal.
Sure.
And chart A in my piece tracks back to the 1955, the earliest we can get the quarterly data. And if you look over that period, the worst quarterly performance for UK GDP was Q1 1974 when it dropped by 2.7%. So compare the worst in that period today, minus 2.7%, to what we're forecast for Q2 this year, minus 35%, and it gives you an idea of just how drastic the effects of this lockdown are going to be.
Sure.
So what I then wanted to do was to say, okay, I can only look at quarterly data back to 1955. If I look at the Bank of England statistics and go back to 1700, where I can go back to, then does that make a difference? Has there been a worse period for GDP? And if you look at chart B, you'll see that in 1706, GDP fell by over 15%. Now that was in the War of the Spanish Succession. And in fact, 3 years later, we had the Great Frost of Europe and GDP dropped by 13%. Now, they were big declines in GDP for the years 1706 and 1709, but the economy looked very different then. But it puts in context just how bad this year could be, because the OBR is forecasting that when lockdown ends, and it's forecasting 3 months lockdown, then an easing, the economy in 2020 will fall by just over 12%. And that will be the third worst fall in 320 years. So it's going to be difficult this year, and that puts it in some context. Let me, however, give some good news. Most of the effects on GDP this year are because of the lockdown. It's not directly because of the coronavirus itself. That's estimated to account for about 10% of the effect on GDP, which means that a drop of minus 31.5% in activity in Q2 is all to do with the lockdown. Now, the lockdown itself doesn't necessarily cause long-term damage. The Great Frost of 1709, the government couldn't do anything about it. You know, they could have brought the Spanish War of Succession to an end in 1706, but there was a conflict. But once the lockdown eases, because it's self-induced, hopefully we'll see the economy bounce back strongly. And that's why I think the OBR's forecast for a dramatic pickup in Q3 and Q4 are realistic.
Sure. And the volatility has reduced over the past sort of 3 centuries. Obviously, we're bound to be better at managing ourselves compared to how we would have been in the 1700s.
Well, you'd hope so, Leo. Yeah, you'd hope so, because we've got a lot more techniques these days. We've got very advanced independent central banks. We've got lots of economists who have written about different things. We've learned our lessons in the last 320 years. Adam Smith didn't write about economics to the 1760s. So when Queen Anne was on the throne and presiding over the two worst economic performances for the UK to date, 1706, 1709, economics wasn't even invented. So you'd hope we'd do a better job these days. But what you can see from chart B is that the peaks and troughs ease over 320 years, and chart C measures the extent to which economic activity differs from its long-term average. And you can see on that chart that volatility has been dropping. And in fact, it dropped right off. It was very steady in Victorian times. And then it wobbled a lot during the last two World War I and World War II in the 1900s, and it's eased off again. So we have got better at managing ourselves, and that's shown in the data.
Great, thanks Gary, and we expect volatility to continue. Next week you've mentioned you'll be looking at the relationship, or the lack thereof, between GDP growth and asset returns. Can you tell us what that means and why you're going to be doing it?
A lot of people think that the market follows current GDP, and that's not the case. If you measure the correlation between GDP and equity returns in the last 120 years in the UK, there is no correlation. And the point I want to look at next week is, what is the relationship between GDP and asset returns? Because a particularly bad year of GDP doesn't automatically mean a bad year of asset returns. And that's what I'll cover in a little bit more detail next week.
Okay, thanks Gary. We'll look forward to that. We've had a few questions as well from clients, so I'll be putting those to you, and next time we catch up, we'll look for some answers on those as well.
Look forward to that, Leo.
Thanks Gary. Have a great weekend. Talk to you soon.
And you. Bye.
Bye now.